everyone, welcome. As we're all coming in, feel free to drop in the chat where you are tuning in from, your team name, and how many people are watching with you. Awesome. I see, oh, we have almost 400 people here. See if we can beat the number for our first webinar. So if you're just joining, please feel free to pop in the chat with where you're tuning in from, your team name, how many people are watching with you. And we'll get started in just a minute once everybody's had a chance to enter. Awesome. And also while we're on this slide, I'll just flag that we have a whole page dedicated to First LEGO League, which you've probably seen because you're here. And on that page, we have all kinds of resources for you, including a list of common challenges that we have compiled, and a recording from our first webinar where a lot of your questions were answered by a different set of panelists. All right, so we'll just get another 10, 20 seconds or so. Feel free to pop in the chat with where you're tuning in from, your team name, and how many people are watching with you.
They're such great names.
Yeah. Actually, I've been very impressed by the team names, and like when people have been emailing and submitting questions and things like that. They're very creative in and of themselves. All right, everyone. So feel free to scan this code now, visit our LEGO League page, and I will pop this slide up later so you will not lose it. Maybe actually someone will pop the link in the chat as well. This is Ask an Archaeologist Tech Edition. So this is our second webinar. Please make sure that you had a chance to head over to the recording of our first webinar where we have answered different and more general questions. So just very briefly, what is archaeology in case you're new here? Archaeology is the study of people through the things they left behind. And a lot of the time we think of archaeology as only the study of ancient people, but it can be about more recent people too. And maybe most importantly is that we are not treasure hunters. We aren't looking to find things. That's not the reason why we do archaeology. We are researchers and we study what people left behind to learn about their lives. So everyone here is doing that in many different ways. And that is what we do at the AIA. So we make archaeology happen. And we'll say a little bit more about the AIA at the end, but there are so many ways for you to experience archaeology yourself. For example, participating in an excavation yourself or attending a lecture or an archaeology fair. So here we have our panelists. I think we'll dive right in. First up on our panel is Anne Duray. She is a Science and Technology Policy Fellow through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Did you know that the American Association for the Advancement of Science has members in more than 91 countries around the world? Anne, what brought you to archaeology? And what is a favorite project or challenge you've tackled in your job or on a field project?
Thanks so much for having me on this webinar. I'm excited to talk about archaeology, and I will quickly answer your question. But I want to also contextualize, so my relationship to the tech aspect is slightly different than some of my fellow panelists. So in the capacity as a fellow, I work at the National Science Foundation, supporting portfolios that have to do with computer science and AI education. So I have been learning a lot about AI. I am not all knowing about it. And I'm obligated to say I am speaking from my own perspective for this whole webinar and not on behalf of the federal government, the NSF, or the AAAS. However, before this kind of career path, I have been an archaeologist for half my life. The thing that most drew me to it was I was just always really interested in history, and then became really intrigued by the idea of like digging up history. And of the sites that I've worked on, they've all had kind of really interesting challenges. But I think the thing I've been thinking of mostly in the context of like tech and computing is for my dissertation, I photographed and then had to analyze thousands of archival documents. And that was really fun and like kind of a whole different type of history. But yeah, I think about if there had been something that was able to analyze and process handwriting for me, I might have written a very different dissertation. So yeah, that's my contribution for that question.
Awesome. Thanks. And next we have Ashley Lemke, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A fun fact about her university is that it has around 23,000 students in total, which that is really big. Ashley, can you tell us what brought you to archaeology and a favorite project or challenge you've tackled in your job or on the field?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to everyone. I've been so thrilled, like, listening to the team names, and they're so excited about what they're doing. I was the kid that watched the History Channel, like, constantly. Like, that is what got me into archaeology 100%. I was so interested in just, like, ancient Rome and Egypt and all these amazing places, and then I got a chance to do archaeology when I was in college. I was just totally hooked. And then I got to be on the History Channel, so it's been really fun. It's been like full circle for me. But in terms of like my favorite, it's fun to say we have favorite challenges.
Yeah.
Challenges are opportunities to grow. But I would say my favorite challenge is I've been working on ancient sites that are submerged beneath the Great Lakes. So they're 9,000 years old and they're in over 100 feet of water. And that's why I'm here today for like tech edition, because we use a lot of tech and robotics and AI and sonar to try to find very ancient sites underwater.
That is, I'm really excited because we have some underwater related questions that we'll throw to you. Don't worry.
Perfect.
And finally, we have Chris Motz, who is the manager of digital assets at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan, a really well-known archaeology museum. The Kelsey Museum holds more than 150,000 artifacts from the ancient world. Chris, same question to you. What brought you to archaeology and a favorite project or challenge you tackled?
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this. I love technology and I love archaeology, and it's really fun to be able to talk about both of them together. So I think what brought me into archaeology, basically, I think people are fascinating. I think human culture is fascinating. When I was in school, I really liked a lot of different subjects. And this is a field where I get to tie a lot of them together. There's history, there's art, there's science. I'm working with computers, there's math. Pretty much any subject, you can find a connection to archaeology. So it's a lot of fun there. In terms of challenges, one of the things that I do is I try to make sense of huge amounts of information. One example of that, I was working with a team at Pompeii to make sense of all of the data that we gathered from about 7 years of excavation. So there were hundreds of thousands of objects, millions of individual pieces of data, and it took another 7 years to analyze it and try to understand the history of that neighborhood. So that's sort of a snippet of what we do.
Wow. And, I think it's like a common misconception about archaeology is that we're always digging, but like, well, you have to do something with the stuff and the information. And so there's actually so much work, usually way more time spent on analyzing and dealing with that material, but then also publishing it. I mean, we'll get into that a little later too. And I also want to shout out to our other AIA friends who are helping us on the back end. So you'll see some of them in the chat to answer some other questions, but this webinar is going to focus on your pre-submitted questions that have to do with archaeology and technology, AI and robotics, and underwater archaeology. So that is where we are going to focus. And don't forget that we have that first webinar with some of your other more general questions. And I forgot to introduce myself. Hello, I'm Jen Thum. I'm an Egyptologist, and I also work at the Harvard Art Museums, which is the art museum on the Harvard University campus, where I oversee all of the learning that happens in our museum, and I am our Egyptologist. So that's me. now we're going to turn to some of those questions that you asked in advance. And we'll start with you, Ashley. What is the most common tool most archaeologists use? And what is the tool that you personally have used the most?
Okay, so most common tool, I'm going to say it, is a trowel. Right? So archaeologists are really good at borrowing.
He's holding one up.
Oh, perfect. Chris has got one. Fabulous. Can't wait to tell. Archaeologists are really good at borrowing things from other sciences and other jobs and other disciplines. So trowels are often used for like bricklaying and gardening, but they're perfect for excavating. So it's like the standard tool that worldwide archaeologists all over use. They'll have like little modifications in different parts of the world, which is fun. But for me, I use trowels all the time, but I actually use a robot the most. So in researching underwater, you as a diver can only be underwater for so long. So it's really good for us to use underwater robots because they can see what's on the ground, they can check out the archaeological site first, they can map everything, they can take photos of everything, you can get videos of everything. And so robots is actually what I use more than anything in terms of a tool.
That's pretty cool. I feel like it's probably a unique answer, but I just want to see if Chris or Anne wants to chime in for this question as well.
For me, I'd say my most common tool is my laptop.
Oh, say more about that.
Yeah.
Because of all the data you're processing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm constantly, working with data, processing 3D models, just all kinds of things. That's most of the time when I'm in the field, I'm actually spending it on my laptop. Yeah.
Pretty cool. Anne, anything you want to add? I know you probably use a trowel a lot.
Yeah, I will say I feel like Greece is weirdly unique. We use trowels, but we prefer small hand picks.
Okay.
We use these like triangle trowels though, which I don't have a visual aid to show, unfortunately. But yeah, I would say personally, mine would be camera and my computer though for archival research. I would just kind of the history of archaeology and the history of how archaeologists have done things and how that relates to their interpretations and research questions and methods. So yeah.
Awesome. We had a common question about some of the tools that archaeologists use to locate items underground without digging. And maybe we could say like tools and methods, I guess. And I know, Ashley, we were talking earlier, you said something about sonar. You want to start there?
Yeah. So archaeology is a destructive science. That's like one good thing to start with too. So once you excavate a site, you can't go back and excavate it again. So we're really careful about excavating and where we dig and why we dig and make sure we have a good reason to do it. So there's tons of tools for us before we ever excavate, before you ever dig into the ground. I use sonar quite a bit. So it creates images, kind of like photography, but photography uses light to take pictures. Sonar uses sound to take pictures. So if you all know like echolocation that dolphins use, where they use sound and then it pings off and it tells them where fish are, it's kind of the similar thing. We use sonar to map the ocean floor and the lake bed to see if there's shipwrecks or if there's ancient sites or temples or cities or things like that. So we get a really good picture of what's going on the surface before we ever start excavating.
Very cool. And I know, I guess, well, if you're thinking about like locating items, even photography is something that we would use, aerial photography, which can be from satellite images, or we used to do with balloons or airplanes. Sometimes we still do. So something that might seem like kind of simple, or as someone said earlier, like a tool borrowed from another thing, is used in archaeology in this way. We had a lot of questions about other, we would call them, I guess, like non-invasive tools in archaeology and technology specifically. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about what LiDAR is, and if you've ever used it in your work?
Yeah, so LiDAR is basically, so it stands for light detection and ranging. So, very long acronym there, but basically it's lasers. Everybody loves lasers. So, shooting lasers out of, sometimes it's coming from a plane, sometimes it's, something on a tripod on the ground. And basically a laser goes out and then it hit something and the light gets reflected back in, and that tool measures the amount of time that it takes for the laser to go out and come back. And that tells you basically how far it is from there to where the laser hit. You do that, shoot a bunch of lasers all over, get a bunch of points, and that gives you sort of a map, a three-dimensional map of what is sort of in front of this device. So you can attach it to, a drone, to a plane, and get, fly back and forth over the landscape or over a site and get a map of an entire site, an entire landscape. But you can also, actually, some iPads and iPhones actually have a teeny tiny little LiDAR module built into them. And we use this on our sites to actually create 3D models very, very quickly of the trenches that we're excavating.
Very cool. And I have actually another question for you about a different acronym or different abbreviation technology, which is GPR, ground penetrating radar. Can you talk a little bit about that? How often is it used? Have you ever used it? Pros and cons? Does it work in wet environments? A few people wanted to know.
Yeah, so it's used fairly pretty commonly. There are several different tools that people can use to try to get some sort of a glimpse of what's buried, in sediments. You can use magnetometry, which is basically measuring sort of differences in magnetic fields from buried stuff. Electrical resistance, which is sort of similar, but measuring differences in how electricity passes through. And then you can use ground penetrating radar, which is sort of a similar idea to sonar, where you're sort of shooting out pulses of electromagnetic energy, but instead of that traveling through water, it's traveling through the ground. So it goes into the ground, it hits something, it bounces back, and you sort of measure the amount of time and the amount of energy that comes back and get a sense of what's under there. It's not perfect. The results that you get, you tend to get a lot of blobs. And so there's a lot of interpreting of those blobs. So, if you've ever had an X-ray, I broke my wrist several years ago and I had to get an X-ray. And on that X-ray, you could see very clearly, the outline of my hand and my wrist. And you could see very clearly the bones of the little break in there. You could see everything very, very clearly. That's not what we get from these techniques. I wish it were, but it's nothing, that clear. And certain types of soils, sandy things don't always work. So, some sites that I've worked on, you get decent results. Other sites, you can't really tell much at all.
Especially since you work in wet environments, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this at all with GPR. Up to you. But Chris reminded me of something that I want to mention, which is another technology related to, or another way we use technology in archaeology. But Ashley, just want to make sure that you're good with GPR. Okay. So Chris's answer reminded me of the fact that we actually do use X-rays and CAT scans for artifacts in museums. So we, for example, at our museum have Egyptian objects where we now know there's a mummified animal inside the sculpture, and we know that because we've X-rayed it. And those are non-invasive technologies that come from medicine that we use so that we don't, as Ashley said, it's a destructive process, so that we don't damage the artifact, but we can tell a little bit more about it by seeing the inside in the same way that you would see your bones inside. So I forgot about that. And actually, maybe this is kind of the flip side of that. Chris, can you say a little bit about 3D scanners in archaeology?
Yeah, absolutely. Much of our work, because we're dealing very often with things and places and buildings, much of our work is inherently three-dimensional. And so it can be really, really useful to be able to capture things in 3 dimensions and be able to turn them around, see them from different angles, and then also share those models with other people. Whether that's looking at it when we're not in the field, or sharing it with colleagues who might be at a different site, or sharing it with students and webinars like this. So, we can create 3D models of whole landscapes, whole sites, using things like LiDAR. And there are techniques to basically use a camera to do the same kinds of things. And there are apps that you can download for your phone that can actually, do something sort of similar to this stuff. And I actually have some examples here.
Oh,
We've done this. Yeah, so this is a faience little figurine here.
Yeah. Oh, it's an Anubis.
Yep, we've got a little Anubis. Let me get it a little closer there.
Yeah.
So this little guy is about 2,000 years old. He's teeny tiny. And we use that technique with cameras to create a 3D model of that. And then we can actually 3D print it at various scales, including blowing him up.
Oh my gosh.
So, this is a little tool that we can use to, people can handle it. We can turn around the object. So there's all kinds of things you can do for documenting and actually analyzing things at different scales using 3D scanning.
You've just reminded me that I have 2 3D prints of ancient objects right here. We can have a contest. This is an Ushabti, a funerary figurine. And look, it's even got the detail of the inscription. This was made by my colleague, Peter Dermanuelian, who's another Egyptologist here at Harvard. All of the artifacts in the museum that he oversees, which is the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, are, when they do 3D models, they're on a sketch fab for the museum. And the other is a little Greek vessel, and this one's for you, an animal-shaped vessel from an exhibition that we did. Oh, cool. And I want to make sure to ask you some questions, so I might change topic a little bit if that's okay with everybody. And let's talk a little bit about AI, if that sounds good. And what role do you think AI could play in archaeology in the future?
Yeah, this is a big question. And like in the general theme, and kind of just like occurred to me while Chris and Ashley were talking too, I think something that's interesting and maybe important for people to understand is kind of thinking about the history of technology and archaeology. These are not all things that have like all of a sudden just happened in the past 10 years. So something like being able to LiDAR something on your iPad, like that is new, and that is that's a big deal. But one of the excavations I looked at for my research in the 1970s was using resistivity survey to like determine where they were digging. So some of this stuff has been, archaeologists kind of always been innovating. And in terms of AI, and this is something the other panelists might have views on as well, or use it even, I'm not like currently using AI in archaeology, but I think my kind of suspicion is, at least in the immediate future, there's going to be more uses for more kind of analytical AI models versus, say, generative. With generative stuff, I think the hallucination problem is perhaps too much, right? Or it would be such that it wouldn't really be saving anyone time. And I think in particular, though, somewhere where it might be useful is, as I've mentioned, my research is kind of the history of archaeology. So I look at archives almost as archaeological artifacts. And so these are notebooks, letters, right? You think about, Ashley talked about how archaeology is destructive. You can't redo the experiment once you've dug something up. And so the history of archaeology is tied to having these like really secure recording methods, and all of that is just put into an archive right when the dig is over. And this produces its own massive amount of data. And there are being tools kind of pioneered now within the context of archives to be able to produce metadata and just like things at a scale that like humans might not be able to. The key is they have to be scanned, which we haven't even gotten to that step in a lot of archives. But
Maybe we need to scan the robot.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the archive has to okay things being scanned, and yeah, but yeah, so I just think anything. I just saw a talk a few weeks ago about, some people might be familiar with the Herculaneum Papyri project, and how analytical AI was used to basically reconstruct some of that text.
Wow.
And so things like that, where you're feeding information that already exists, but like you're just having it being outsourced to something that can kind of like analyze it in a way that just like humans maybe can't, or can't in a certain amount of time.
I'll throw this question out to Chris and Ashley too. Like, are you currently using AI or a project that you're working on? Are you using AI or someone on the project using AI? And also, what role do you think it could play in archaeology in the future, Ashley?
I'm like nodding fiercely in the back. So it's kind of like a weird application of it, but because underwater archaeology of like ancient landscapes is so new, like not that many people have done that, and it's huge areas to explore and it's expensive, we've used artificial intelligence to help us narrow down like our research areas, like where are we gonna look? So specifically, I study caribou hunters, ancient caribou hunters, and we have a virtual world. We kind of roll back the clock and say, this is what it looked like 9,000 years ago. And then there's artificial intelligence caribou that migrate across that landscape. And then that helps us predict where ancient hunters might have hunted those caribou. So AI can run like thousands and thousands and thousands of migrations, and it can show us where the animals were most likely to go. So the animals are there, it's likely the people are going to be there that were hunting them. So we use artificial intelligence that way. But colleagues of mine are also using artificial intelligence to process sonar data to look for shipwrecks. So like Anne said, right, there's like, it takes just people so much time to process so much data that you can train AI to be like, find stuff that looks like this. So you show it what shipwrecks look like, and then it can process a lot of data very quickly and pick out things that look strange. That works for shipwrecks. It wouldn't work for everything. So like I've told people like it's never going to replace anybody. Like we're always going to have boots on the ground as archaeologists, but I think it's going to make us maybe more effective and efficient, like help us narrow down search areas.
Chris, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that it could be used for. Some of the sort of repetitive tasks of just doing basic identifications of certain, types of objects. Where, currently either you need to just have a mental library of all of these different possible shapes and decorative types of pottery, or have, a whole arsenal of reference books with you. That still takes a lot of time to go through thousands of pieces of pottery. And so, maybe that might be some way that we can, leverage AI on that. But then coming back to sort of some of the stuff that Anne was talking about with archives. So at the museum where I work, we've been sponsoring excavations for over 100 years. And so there are sites that were excavated in the 1920s that have either been reburied or have been damaged since then. And it would be really great to be able to 3D model some of them. We have some photos of them, but only maybe a couple, of each building. And using those methods that I was talking about before, where you take a bunch of photos and create a 3D model, you need a lot of photos from lots of different angles. So maybe AI can fill in some of those gaps, take just a few photos and fill in some of those missing pieces. And I think generally archaeologists have lots of missing pieces. We have very incomplete sets of information. And so that might be a way that AI can help.
Speaking of missing pieces, this reminds me of a project that a colleague of mine is working on with AI here at our museum in, I think it was the 1980s. Some of the coins in the collection here, ancient coins, were stolen. And she and a student are using AI to mine the art market, like mine the internet, to see if she can find some of the missing coins. Now, why is that a little harder to do with coins? Because a coin is replicated many times. There are many copies of the same coin. You can find two of the same quarter maybe in your pocket right now if you're in the US. So that's a challenge, but identifying where, if they are being sold, if that type of coin is being sold, is one of the ways that she and the student are using AI. And that is like, I can't even wrap my head around what it would be like to try to do that manually. So this is like her, a fun effort to see if it works, I guess. And what's there to lose, basically. Let's talk a little bit more about data, actually. And this is an open question for anyone. I know, Chris, you have a little bit to say about this already, so we can start with you if you like. Is there a common database or software or program for archaeologists to save information? Like, do different databases talk to each other? Are there ones that are more popular? How do we share information with other archaeologists? Things like that.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start off with this one. No, there is not one. There is not one database out there. You know, there are some that are more popular. There's maybe half a dozen really popular ones. You know, ways of organizing data, but archaeologists really like to customize things. And you know, some of that is just the quirks of our personalities, but also, you know, we're dealing in lots of different time periods. We're dealing with lots of different cultures. You know, lots of different research methods, research questions, people working in different, you know, states, countries, languages. You know, some countries and states have their own requirements that sort of point you or force you to use a particular method. And so it's really hard to, you know, try to find one thing that sort of fits everybody. And there are some ways that we can get data to talk to each other. It gets pretty technical pretty quickly there. And it is tricky, but there are some ways to sort of get one database to talk to something that's completely different, but it's hard.
Mhm. Anyone else want to answer? Oh, please, Ashley.
Maybe I was just gonna, it's not like database is kind of a broad word, but like GIS, so Geographic Information Systems, I would say is one of the ones that a lot of people use.
That's such a good point. I didn't even
Right.
think about that.
I know I didn't
A little
either
bit
until
about
Chris was talking.
Yeah. What GIS is and how we use it. Can you say a little bit?
Yeah, so GIS is Geographic Information Systems. It's like a broad category of computer programs that help you organize spatial data. So archaeologists love maps is like the short version. We have a lot of spatial data, like where the artifacts were when we excavated them, where they are on the planet, where they are in relation to each other. So that's the one that's like, it's not the same. Each project makes their own map and their own GIS database for their own project. But that's one, like, as a tool, as a class of tools, a lot of archaeologists use that.
Can't believe I didn't think about either. And
Yeah. The like database question is interesting, and I used to think a lot about this in terms of just like the kind of trajectory. So I worked at an excavation in Greece, Athenian Agora. At the time, this program iDig, which was like all recording on iPads, is being rolled out, and there was a lot of resistance. Kind of one of the goals is trying to get other sites to adopt it, and there was a lot of resistance. And I think, you know, Chris spoke to this and Ashley a little bit. There's this like desire to individualize. Everyone wants to create their best database system, right, for their site, because their site we excavate like this, and like this is and I think it comes out of this kind of, you know, history having to deal with recording being super important. But an issue that will come up and has already come up with digital recording, at least, is preservation of digital databases. I've worked on excavations with people who've worked in certain parts of the world. Someone was telling me about this dig in like early 2000s in Serbia, where it was all digital, and like stuff isn't accessible anymore because no one maintained the kind of database platform. So this is kind of use of databases is also important for thinking of kind of future proofing, I guess, in a way, and why so many sites, at least in Greece, still want to still do the paper recording as well, in some form, which of course creates even more records and stuff you have to store and manage and what have you. But
and
yeah.
you know, Anne, this is a great point because this happens in museums too. And I'm sure Chris will nod his head at this, that like we at our museum, we have some digital records, but primarily we're working on paper and we're kind of hesitant to digitize things. And it's because of like the concerns about how will we make sure that people still have access to that information. And there are some, just as there is with like seeing an artifact in its context and seeing an artifact's what we would call the materiality, the materialness of it, it gives you more information. That can happen with paper records as well. You know, if someone drew a drawing of something and then erased it and you can see that they made a mistake, maybe there's some information there about why they interpreted something differently before they erased it and changed their mind. Or maybe the handwriting will tell you that it was two different people writing in the same notebook about the same thing. There are so many more like kind of human things behind the physical characteristics of what we do on site, like the artifacts of an excavation and artifacts themselves. We had a lot of questions about like how we communicate and connect in the field. I wonder if we can tackle some of those. So what, for example, is the biggest issue with using technology in remote places? Ashley, you're making a face. You want to say something about that?
To always update the software. That sounds so silly, but that's such a real thing. So I've been on like offshore, like 100 miles offshore on research boats, and you don't always have internet. Like sometimes you do, depends on the research vessel. But to make sure everything's updated, because everything can be working, but all of the hardware might be working, right? Like the robot itself. But if the software isn't updated and you don't have internet access to be able to get that update, like then you can't work. And we always laugh, like there isn't like a Home Depot buoy, like 50 miles offshore, you know what I mean? There's like nowhere to go. So in terms of challenges working in remote places, archaeologists are really good at like checklist, like packing list and like checklist. And you take like 4 of everything because, you know what I mean? Like if 1 is good, like 2 is better kind of situation. Like everything with like batteries, like PVC, like, bungee cords, like things that you just not sure you'll be able to get. I would say it's the biggest thing, like being prepared. We're like prepared for the worst, like hoping for the best, basically, when we go to the field.
Great mantra for an archaeological project. Yeah. And you're reminding me of like, I don't know, some of the other ways that we might even like charge things in the field, like if you can't plug things in. Does anybody here use solar panels when they're in the field?
I haven't, but that makes a ton of sense.
I've used like a little traveling one just to keep like my phone charged in the field, especially if it's sunny, it'll work. But I'm not aware of any digs like really using solar panels as like a main source of electricity.
Which is bonkers because we usually are working in really hot, sunny areas. Like it was like, you know what I mean?
And like I have a little travel one that's like attached to your backpack. So I don't know. Maybe this is a place for innovation for our challenge. And does anyone want to comment on whether or not electronics that we use on site are affected by dust and heat? So you've got them, they're working, but yeah, Chris.
Yes, they absolutely are. Just like we are affected by dust and heat, so are they. That's one of the great things about the iPad. That sort of revolutionized our ability to use computers and tablets in the field is that they don't have a fan. If you're using a traditional computer, the way that it cools itself is by pulling in colder air from outside inside the computer. And if that air is dusty, that gets real bad real fast. And so, different, technologies that don't need to be cooled by a fan are really important. If an iPad gets dusty, we can wipe it off. It's fine. But you do have to be careful, don't leave it out in the sun. We have to be careful to store them in the shade. And yeah, if it's 90 degrees outside, that limits, the amount of sort of really intensive processing that a device can do. If it's, analyzing various kinds of data, sometimes they do sort of overheat and you have to, pause for an hour or 2 to let it cool down. So it can be a struggle sometimes.
Although I guess that doesn't mean that like the excavation work has to stop, but maybe things get delayed, I guess. So different challenges in terms of like timing or
it's like cold too.
Oh, that's fair. My iPhone stops working when it's really cold. So
yeah, we think of it being really hot, but we use like GoPros underwater to film. And in the Great Lakes, it's like 35 on the bottom and the batteries drain really fast. And in that scenario, like you can't do anything. If the mission is to take pictures and the battery's dead, you have to put another one in. Like you have to go all the way back up to the boat, get another one, and come all the way back down.
Yeah, Ashley, you've actually anticipated one of the questions that someone had submitted ahead of time, which is whether or not you use cameras underwater. So you use GoPro.
Oh, good. Yes.
Any other cameras that you use underwater?
Yeah. So actually 360 cameras are the best. Or that's what a lot of archaeologists have been using lately. It gives you this really neat kind of like fisheye view of what's going on. And it sees more than you do. So when you're diving or you have it attached to the robot, like it's seeing the different angles and different corners of things than you can. GoPros, like I said, they've been working great, but like in cold water, their batteries run out really fast. Pressure underwater can hit the buttons. Like the
Oh my
caches will
gosh.
shrink and not shrink, and so it'll turn it off when you're trying to record to make like a 3D video or something like that. So we use a ton of cameras underwater. Our biggest like challenge in that would be lighting, usually.
Okay.
In some places you have really good visibility and good lighting, but in others you don't. So you have to have not just the camera, but like a lighting apparatus to make sure that you're seeing like the archaeological site as good as you can.
Right. This again hasn't even occurred to me because I've always worked on land and in very dry places, I'll say as well. Yeah.
Solar power.
Yeah, you need a different light source. Yeah, people wanted to know what the toughest challenge is for underwater archaeologists, and that sounds like a pretty tough challenge. And I just want to take a minute to remind everybody that we do have a Q&A box. That is where you should put other questions, but we are answering questions live verbally that were pre-submitted. There were hundreds of them, so we're not answering every question, but we're answering the most common ones. And then we have some of our friends from the AIA staff on the back end answering other questions if they can. So thank you for your patience. All right. So let's talk a little bit about preservation. This has come up a few times. We're going to talk about preservation of artifacts, but also sites. So let's start with objects. How is technology used to preserve artifacts? Or you could take the word preserve very broadly.
Yeah, so I can speak to this. So this is something that, working at a museum, I work very closely with our conservators who are responsible for conserving or basically protecting and preserving the artifacts. And they use all kinds of technology. There's something called X-ray fluorescence or XRF, which sort of like the lasers, it goes pew pew at these objects. Shoots X-rays at them, and it basically tells you what they are made out of, sort of what what elements are in that area that just got zapped. And so they use that information to basically see what an object is made out of, to make sure that they're going to use the right techniques to preserve them. They use manual techniques, applying certain glues, but then they have to know what kind of glue is appropriate. Or they might, apply some solution to sort of reverse a particular type of damage. Well, then they need to know exactly what is going on chemically with that spot on that object in order to know the right stuff to use so that they don't do more damage, but they also are able to reverse any damage or prevent any future damage. But we can also use, 3D models to, basically use the model to 3D print like a support for an object. You can use it to as sort of a substitute. If there's an object that is particularly delicate, we might create a 3D model that people can actually use to do research, so that instead of handling that object, they're actually working with the 3D model. So there's all different kinds of ways that we can use technology for preserving those artifacts.
You hit on all the main ones that are like archaeological science, conservation science, like go-tos. We did have some specific questions about preserving different kinds of materials specifically. So just generally technology, not necessarily as the main kind of idea, but what do archaeologists use to preserve organic materials such as wood? And what about other materials like metals, like bronze, for example?
I can do wood.
Go ahead, talk about.
I don't know bronze. I'm a prehistorian. So for wood, at least wood when it's found underwater, the best place for artifacts is actually to stay underwater. So what we say as underwater archaeologists is the best thing is to leave it in place. We just take maybe small samples up to the surface because water is really good at preserving organic materials like wood and plants, like these sorts of things. But if you bring it up, there's a couple different technologies that you can use. Freeze drying is something that archaeologists use to have the wood. That way it preserves like the original shape of the piece of wood if it's part of a shipwreck or maybe just a natural tree. And then the other thing, which is kind of crazy, we slowly inject it with polyethylene glycol. So PEG is what it's called. It's like PEG treatment. So you basically slowly remove the water from the wood, and then you replace that with plastic, basically, to then retain the shape, and then it will preserve for longer. So it's interesting, like we always think of excavating and like recovering artifacts, but like Chris said, like, and too, like the conservation of artifacts once they're removed from either the dirt or the water is a really long, very complicated technical process. And it's a lot of skill that's needed to do that. Like there aren't thousands of archaeologists running around that are conservators that know how to do that kind of work.
Mm. Ashley, have you ever been to the Vasa Museum in
I
Stockholm,
I
Sweden?
haven't. I want to go so bad.
Anne's been there. I've been there. Chris, I
Oh,
don't know if you've been there.
amazing.
It is a giant ship that they built a museum around because they saved it from it was basically wrecked for like 400 years, a little less than 400 years. And they brought it up. They did the soaking out of the salts and the replacement with the plastic and all this stuff. Egg. Now I learned something new today. And then they built the museum around it, and you can see the boat like it looks like it was made yesterday. It's so crazy, but that took decades of work. And just because someone asked about other materials, like what are the opposite of wood, like something like bronze, those materials can actually be equally fragile when exposed to a new environment. If it's survived this long, part of the reason why, same as wood, is because it's been in a stable environment. Bronze can actually get something called bronze disease. That's our word for it. I don't know what it's called technically. There's a scientific term for it, I'm sure. But archaeologists call it bronze disease. It is where you basically see the metal fall apart in front of you because it's been exposed to too much oxygen or different temperature changes and it turns to dust. So every material has its own special needs in terms of preservation, and science is what helps us understand what those needs are. All right, so let's talk a little bit about preservation of sites. Actually, I've got a question for you, Anne, first, just on the relating to like finding materials and how we deal with them, which is several people wanted to know about what dry sieving, wet sieving, and flotation are, and if you have any challenges with those methods.
Yeah, so these are all important things for archaeological fieldwork. They are not very exciting, maybe, to people who are not archaeologists, but they do present challenges. So I think it's important to go over them. So I guess to start, dry sieving is most commonly done on site. And basically, right, you're digging up dirt, and you pull out the things you can see, right? You can easily see like large pieces of pottery or bone or what have you. But there's some smaller stuff you might miss, right, in your scoop full of dirt, like coins or beads or really small pieces of pottery. So what you do is after you have your collection of dirt in whatever vessel, you dump it on a large metal screen, and then you sit there and shake it and go through and pick out basically any small artifacts. So that's dry sieving. And then you have to kind of constantly be moving the dirt out from underneath the sieve, right? Wet sieving, I've done less commonly on sites, kind of the same idea, but you're applying water to kind of help identify and move the dirt. Flotation is very common and also very important in archaeology. So basically, archaeologists, right, as we said at the beginning, are studying the human past. One of the things that's important for the human past is like what people were eating, what sorts of things, are they something like change of diet could have, different social like implications. So a lot of times, right, you're not going to excavate something that has like a fully cooked meal, right? That's not how things preserve. So the things that do preserve in organic materials are often very small and very light. And the way you get this stuff is through flotation. And the way I've done it, it's kind of hard to describe without a visual, but I'm sure you can Google archaeology flotation and like find a video. There's a big tank. You put mesh in it, you take a certain amount of dirt from what you're excavating. You have to, I've done flotation offsite, so this involves transporting large bags of dirt to wherever your flotation tank is. And you dump in your dirt. The tank's being filled with water, and then a pump is kind of moving the water around. So on the top mesh, you're catching what we call heavy residue. So these are the types of things you might also find in dry sieving. Maybe you just like didn't have time to dry sieve everything, or like didn't catch everything. So you'll have like really small pottery, other types of things. I worked on an excavation where we found a bunch of beads. And then while the water is being moved around, the organic material is lighter than the dirt, right? So dirt sinks to the bottom, organic residue rises up and is kind of siphoned off onto basically something like a cheesecloth. And then that is separately dried out and analyzed by people who have expertise in kind of looking at some of these organic remains. So yeah, it's a movement of dirt problem. It's a challenge, I guess. It's not a problem, challenge, opportunity. It's a kind of storage issue as well for all of this stuff. A site I worked on before never got through all the flotation samples they took. So sometimes the team would have to go back in like October, which like, oh no, trip to Naxos in October. To be clear, I wasn't involved in this, but other members of the team and like finish the flotation samples. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but also super important. And a lot of people do it on sites now on their excavation.
I just want to be mindful of the time. And once again, we have a first webinar that is recorded where we answered a lot of the questions that I'm seeing pop up in the Q&A box. So you should go back and watch that webinar. And also just a reminder, we're only answering questions that were submitted ahead of time, but our friends in the back end might be able to get to some of your other questions. Got a couple more I think we could squeeze in, guys. How do you protect sites from natural disasters? Chris, you want to go for this one?
Sure. I mean, natural disasters are extremely powerful, and there's not a whole lot you can do. We just thinking of places where people live, we do our best to build houses and build modern buildings in order to withstand certain natural disasters, but even that doesn't work all the time. And imagine trying to do that for something that was built 2,000 years ago. There's not a ton that we can do. We try not to alter ancient remains too much. And so we can't exactly just, completely surround, the Colosseum in, thick scaffolding, because then, nobody will be able to see it. We wouldn't be able to learn anything from it. Ashley was talking just a minute ago about, how important it is to keep waterlogged remains wet, and how that basically helps keep them preserved. Unfortunately, due to climate change, at a site called Vindolanda in northern England, that has famous, amazing, ancient remains, organic remains like shoes, leather shoes.
I was just gonna say, I know it for the shoes. That's how I know Vindolanda.
Amazing stuff.
Shoes. Yeah,
and that's all preserved because it's wet, and it has stayed wet. There's unfortunately some evidence that due to climate change, the water table is changing and fluctuating, and some of those remains are starting to get dried out periodically and then wet again, and that change actually starts to break them down, and it over time those amazing remains won't necessarily survive. And so basically the best thing that we can do is try to prevent some of these natural disasters as best we can. Big storms, wildfires, flooding, sea level rise, those are all threats to archaeological remains. And so, we basically, the only thing we can do is try to lessen the impact of those or prevent them.
Some of our other questions about like preservation and protection relating to like how do we protect sites from looting and vandalism and other things. It's not just natural disasters that are we're sort of up against. And oh, I also had all these other questions about robots that I know we actually talked a little bit about robots, but it's just occurred to me that like could use a robot to surveil a site overnight to make sure that it's protected, something like that. So just to sort of get us a little more into a robot robot mode for our last question or two. That's when I can think of robots being used in archaeology. And Ashley already talked about ways that she is using robots. Any other ways that you feel there could be an intersection between robotics and archaeology? This is a question for any.
Yeah, I think the underwater, like getting into tricky places. So one of the other places we've talked about using robotics is sinkholes in Mexico and in many parts of the world, but like there's underwater things in sinkholes. And so it's not the easiest place to get like a scuba diver or something like that. So doing robotics. I joke around all the time. I really want to start a project off the coast of South Africa because there's a lot of archaeological sites underwater there, but it's also where great white sharks hang out.
Oh, so safety by robot.
Yeah, it's a safety situation where I was like, the robot can go first, and then we can see what happens afterwards. So those are a couple of ways that we've done it. A lot of people are asking, like, we don't have robots right now that have like surgical precision, so like excavate. Like that's as far as I'm aware. There's some that can go and retrieve artifacts for sure. But we're not at the level where it's like gonna replace someone that's going down and like carefully removing the artifacts and excavating it that way.
And also just again to like bring the human back into it. I know at least when I'm excavating, like so much of understanding what is in front of you is by feel and by very human senses of sight, even smell, texture, things that could be interpreted by a very sophisticated robot, but there is just so much of like experience and knowledge from just knowing what things feel like in the ground or maybe also underwater, I don't know, that I feel like you would need to really figure out how to do that so that we don't lose that extra information that really comes from ourselves as people. So in our last minute or so, I want to throw this question out to everyone. What advice would you give kids interested in archaeology? Anne, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I don't know, I guess I'm not employed in archaeology right now, so I'm not the best person, but yeah, yeah, I think it is something where, right, you're not in like a, kind of earlier education environment. You're not taking an archaeology class, but it's integrated in so many things. As Chris said earlier, archaeology comes up with like all the, involves all these different aspects of history, science, so on. So there are like ways that a lot of K-12 educators can incorporate archaeology in their teaching. And so that is, I think, important. I think at the college level, yeah, it's maybe more tangible in a way that you can take classes and connect with excavation opportunities and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that is the kind of like, I think advantage though of that it connects with so many different types of topics and in that way to connect with it and in a specific way that like speaks to you and your background, right?
Like, don't forget your special skills. There's always need for example, someone who really loves pottery, someone who really loves bones. Chris, you want to answer next? Advice for kids interested in archaeology in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah, I would just say learn as much as you can about as many different things as you can. Yeah, archaeology touches on so many things and you never know what little tidbit of information your brain is going to pull out that you learned 10 years ago that will suddenly be relevant again.
Including long like languages you studied a long time ago that suddenly you need. Ashley, how would you answer this question?
You guys are already doing it because you're in this challenge. So I think this is super cool, right? To get involved in things like this where you're learning more about, the technology side of things and the archaeology side of things. And if you're interested in it, like people always ask, like, haven't we found everything already? And like, We have not. There's going to be job security for archaeologists for a long time. We've just barely scratched the surface about what to find. So good luck with the challenge. This is my Lego robot diver that wants to say hello. Good luck also. She's also 3D printed. But yeah, I would just say maintain your curiosity about the world around you, and archaeology is a great way to do that.
What a fantastic prop for this. Well, let me just remind everyone that we have a whole resource page for First Lego League Challenge. And on that page, you can find the recording of the first webinar. You will also find the recording of this webinar and a whole list of challenges that AIA member archaeologists thought were common challenges that we'd love to have you tackle. And there's some other information on there too, other resources from the AIA and other partners. I also want to mention that we do have 2 publication offers at the moment. If you're in the US and you can get paper magazines shipped to you, we have a bundle of Archaeology magazine and an Archaeology 101 handout. And if you're not in the US or you don't love print materials, never fear. You can also get digital access to all of archaeology going back almost 100 years. And we have AIA student memberships with access to our whole archive. So you can check that out too at archaeological.org/join. And last thing, until mid-October, we also have a new challenge for you that is open for you to submit to. It's open to anyone. They don't have to be AIA members. Create your favorite monument or site with your favorite building bricks. They can be any kind of bricks, but maybe they'll be Legos. And the winner gets a 1-year AIA membership. So visit us online, and we really look forward to seeing what you all come up with as your projects for this challenge. Thanks for joining us, and thank you to all of our panelists and to our friends from the AIA on the back end who've been heroically answering questions throughout the hour. Thank you, everyone.